Hey everybody, Tom Barnes, stories from the 78, going to Chicago South Side for a wonderful story. And my friend Samantha, say your last name. I'm going to try it real quick, but Ege?
Perfect.
Oh, all right. Well, there we go. We'll call you Samantha just in the interview going forward because I'm one for one on that. But you wrote this incredible book about a time and place on Chicago South Side and a group of women that put classical music in the Black community on full display. Why don't you talk about the book real quick and introduce yourself?
So my name is Dr. Samantha Ege. I am a music historian and concert pianist based in the UK. As you can tell, I am not from Chicago. I'm not from the US. But I was so drawn to this story of Florence Price, who in 1933 became the first Black woman to have a symphony played by a major orchestra, which was the Chicago Symphony. But as a music historian, I wondered, well, how did that happen? How did this Black woman, defeat the odds to make it in classical music during that time? And so through visiting Chicago, going to the libraries, the archives, reading through these primary sources, it became very apparent that there was so much more to the story. And that's where my book comes in.
Yes, South Side Impresarios is the name of the book. Comes out on the, what did I say here? On the 12th of this month. And it delves into Chicago's South Side. And, for folks from Chicago or not from Chicago, the South Side's a very proud place of Chicago. A lot of history has come out of there. But do you know exactly where on the South Side of this, like the area that you're speaking to?
So when I was able to map it out, really it's incredibly broad.
Hmm.
And it extends in some ways to the west side, but I think what I could see is that there was a sort of concentrated cohort, sort of the whole length really of the south side. And yeah, just a lot of dynamic movement in that space.
Yeah, that's impressive. I mean, Chicago South Side is massive. Actually it's bigger than the North Side. And you have Bronzeville that had a lot of the blues artists, at one time that lived there that really, put Chicago on the map for like soul music and blues music. But this supersedes all of that with classical music. So, you know, talk about like what you did. I know you mentioned you went to like the libraries and stuff like that, but like what did you find out that you wanted to tell for the story? Like what do people not know?
Well, I think people in general do not know that classical music was taking shape among people of African descent in Chicago from, as early as the late 19th century. And so you had Jubilee singing groups like the Fisk Jubilee Singers and all the groups that they inspired, who would program, European songs as well as spirituals. And so this is kind of laying a blueprint for a Black classical music aesthetic that is both a mix of African American heritage and classical music, the European style as well. And what was really interesting to learn was that, people talk about the Harlem Renaissance, when it comes to talking about this era of revival, reinvigoration, etc. But when you trace classical music in Black Chicago, you see that actually predates the Harlem Renaissance, and that some of the protagonists that I look at were already talking about a Chicago Renaissance, in 1917. So it completely, I think, transforms what we think we know about these different periods in history.
And definitely, lays the groundwork what we were talking about before with the blues and the soul, but even gospel music. You mentioned gospel music that started here in Chicago on Chicago South Side. In finding all this new information, how is it only now that you found it? Like, I mean, it seems like and I don't mean that as how it sounded really,
No,
but
it's
like,
random. I'm from the UK.
right. So how does some like, we have the major universities in Chicago, research and all that stuff. Somebody from the UK finding this information and kind of telling people from Chicago, hey, by the way, you have like this beautiful history here that nobody knows about. So I'm going to write this book. Like, how did you find yourself into this entire story here?
So, as well as being a music historian, I'm a performer. And I like to clarify, I'm not sort of your typical pianist. So, the music that I play really just comes from what I'm interested in.
Mm.
And so, through learning about people like Florence Price and Margaret Bonds and this wider network of Chicago composers, I simply started playing their music. And that led to an opportunity to perform with the African American network of the Chicago Symphony. They hosted an event where I got to share this work and play this work. And there were members of the audience who were actually a part of these networks that I was beginning to learn about and beginning to write about. And so becoming connected to communities that are still very much uplifting and continuing these histories was a reminder that actually this story is, it's still very present. The history is still there, and maybe it speaks to the kind of segregated nature of Chicago that not everyone knows about it, mm-hmm. even though this culture of Black classical music making is still going strong. And so I think perhaps sometimes being an outsider can afford you certain advantages in a way, to be able to tell certain stories. But I also wanted to really honor this history and not kind of speak over the voices. And so that's something that I try to achieve in my writing style.
You definitely achieve that in the writing style. It's just you've created this world. I think a lot of people are maybe jealous that they didn't know prior, because it's another layer of the onion that is Chicago, really, with the segregation and, different neighborhoods going through transformations and throughout history. A lot happened, prior to World War II, and a lot happened after World War II and after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So Chicago has this history of these pockets that, unless you're looking for it, you don't know. And it seems like you found something pretty special here. With all this information in the book, like, what would you want to see now going forward with this kind of new discovery prior to what people knew about the Harlem Renaissance?
I mean, I would want people to think, well, what other stories are missing? What else is there for us to find literally in our own backyards? It was really, it was so eye-opening for this world to be revealed to me the more and more, I asked questions and followed various rabbit holes, and it was all very exciting as well, actually. So I hope it kind of lays a blueprint for people who think, for people who are perhaps intimidated by the idea of trying to find something that seems impossible to find. There are always ways if we remain curious and we keep asking questions.
And were you just digging around, finding, like, where was the plethora of knowledge? Where would it come from? Various spots, where would you find all that good stuff?
Yeah, so it's a mix, really. So the Center for Black Music Research at Columbia College Chicago has been an incredible resource, just because it's such a pioneering institution to bring all of these primary resources together. So a lot of the clubs that I write about, like the Robert Nathaniel Dett Club, the National Association of Negro Musicians, mm-hmm. a lot of those materials could be found there. I also went to Arkansas, which is where Florence Price was from. And so looking through those materials, seeing the way who she talks about, reading diary entries where she runs into Frederick Stock outside the Chicago Symphony, gives you a sense of geography. And then also my work took me to New Orleans, where there's some materials about Chicago as well, which kind of made me wonder, how did they end up there? But if I could find a source, I would try and get out there and read this material firsthand. And it's funny when you go into it with no sort of preconception of what your final narrative is, mm-hmm. and it allows the material to kind of speak to you in a way.
You talk about, New Orleans, and a friend of mine wrote a book about the Blues Highway, and part of that highway extends from New Orleans to Chicago because, all these blues musicians that came from the South hopped on this blues highway all the way up to Chicago, either through Route 66 or what have you. But they found their way to Chicago because Chicago was like the Mecca, the place where people can escape the South of oppression and everything else. And Chicago was hiring, it had manufacturing, and freedom to do things that perhaps they weren't allowed to do in the South. So it's interesting that you find some of those same similarities that she found with the blues music, because Willie Dixon, who is a blues musician, has a foundation here, or he was a blues musician. The foundation is here at Old Chess Records, where Etta James and others have recorded. So kind of a full circle moment in that way. But I mean, I imagine it was a lot of fun finding all this information. Is there something that sticks out to you that is something that you just continue to take with you today that's really special?
There are many things, but yes, I can definitely give you one example. So Margaret Bonds, who I really frame as a daughter of Black classical Chicago, she was a student of Florence Price's, and she wrote in an essay in 1967 about just reminiscing really about her upbringing, about what influenced her as a composer, as a pianist. And she talks about this moment around the 1930s where Florence Price is going through a divorce. She becomes a single mother. This is set against the backdrop of the Great Depression. So this is a really difficult time for her. And Margaret Bonds' mother, Estella, takes her into their home. And there's a big composition competition coming up for African American composers, and Margaret Bonds talks about how every Black musician in Chicago would come around and help Florence Price copy out all the parts to meet her deadline. So as I'm reading this essay that Margaret Bonds has written, it strikes me as just so serious, and there's an urgency. And then I learned that there was a recording of Margaret Bonds talking about her life, which is held at Emory University in Atlanta. So another place to visit. And as I'm listening to Margaret Bonds tell this story, there are moments where she just bursts into fits of giggles. She talks about how Florence Price was a procrastinator, and she talks about this moment of all the Black musicians copying out the music with such warmth and such laughter, and that completely transformed how I understood that period. She kind of breathed new life into the narrative, and she really humanized Florence Price as well, because when we think of especially classical composers, they are almost godlike, right? So for her for us to know that Florence Price was someone who sometimes just struggled to get her work done and needed help was so powerful. And also just to hear Margaret Bonds' voice as well, because
that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, because often, I don't know what Florence Price's voice sounds like. We just know her voice through her music, really, which is obviously very much open to interpretation. So it just felt like this rare treasure to come across this and to be able to talk about laughter within this book as well as the difficult times.
What would you think Florence Price would say about all this?
I get the sense she would be overwhelmed because from what I have read in the Chicago Defender especially, she had a more reserved personality. She was quite introverted. And even in her letters to the conductor of the Boston Symphony, she said, that she was a timid person. She's not very good at aggressively advocating for herself. So I think that she would be deeply moved, but I think that she would be, just in light of the personality that she seemed to have, probably quite overwhelmed by the level of attention, as much as it is thoroughly deserved.
And you say thoroughly deserved. How important is this to the music community in general as a whole, as far as music history, for, not just the United States, obviously, but just for music history?
I think there are many layers to this importance. On a musical level, what Florence Price's music does is that it gives us a deepened understanding of the classical music aesthetic, and it complicates the ideas around classical music being, a European or a white or a male genre. She was writing classical music at the age of 3. She was
That's
incredibly
incredible.
talented. It is. This was, this was her life, really. And so she allows us to hear classical music in different ways and to understand the mastery of classical music in different ways. But then I would also say, just on a social level, to learn of a woman of African descent, growing up in the Jim Crow South, being part of that Great Migration narrative as well. She teaches us so much about history. She teaches us about the impact of the politics of place, of migration, of community. There's a lot that we learn about social worlds and social lives and how we become what we are, because Florence Price was musically talented from birth,
Yeah.
but without society, without her social world, without her community, how many other Black women would have benefited from having the kind of network that Florence Price had? So her importance is incredibly deep and layered.
And much more that more impressive that it happened at a time when it did in our history as a country here in the United States and in the world, for that matter, as far as rights and women's rights and everything else. This happened at the time where a lot of that wasn't even a thing. So for the fact that she was trailblazing in a male dominated area, in a, as you said, there wasn't too many Black composers back then doing what she was doing to the level that she was doing. I mean, it's just an astounding story, really, like for people who are either music lovers or history lovers or just really want to know a good story. This is definitely one of them.
Thank you. That really means a lot. I mean, I really wanted to tell a music history in a way that I personally felt it hadn't been told before. Especially, I'm talking about classical music. With a lot of classical music, the stories tend to focus on one composer and their genius and their greatness in a way that is quite detached from our realities as human beings that go through various challenges, and human beings that need other human beings in order to thrive and survive. And so I really wanted to take on a different kind of storytelling in order to do justice to not only Florence Price's narrative, but I also, make space to think about the women that we don't know, because of everything that you've described. There are so many women who had similar promise, similar potential to Florence Price. And we know this because Florence Price wasn't the first Black woman to study at the New England Conservatory, for example.
Right.
So I want to create space for us to think about those that would otherwise be forgotten.
And I think you did that masterfully in your book, that's just coming out here on the 12th. Are you doing a book tour? Are you coming to talk about your book at any time soon in the States?
Yes, so I have a short whirlwind visit in November, but I will be in the States in Chicago specifically, for several weeks of April, which is Florence Price's birthday month. So it would be great to, continue these conversations. One of the events that I'm doing is at the Newberry Library, which is where a lot of this research took shape, and I'll be performing as well.
That was my next question. Where can we hear you perform?
Yes, so definitely at the Newberry, and we're working out some more Chicago dates. So I'm looking forward to that.
But in general, if people want to find where you're performing or any more information about what you do, what's the best way for them to go about doing that?
They can go to my website, which is my name, SamanthaEge.com, and everything is there.
South Side Imperio. I had say the name. You say the name of the book so I don't stumble over it again. Go for it.
South Side Impresarios.
Impresarios. Yeah, you say it much more eloquently than my Chicago accent allows. Samantha, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me. I know it's late there in the UK, but I hope you have a wonderful weekend ahead of you.
Thank you. And thank you just for the honor of being able to share this work with you.